Okay, this next module is the second in a series of 3. So we have to see it in the context of where it sits. Industry and competitive analysis, which basically is the middle one of our 3 readings brought in 2024 curriculum, starting with the previous module, which was analysing the company. If you recall, we did revenue, operating profit, working capital, capital investments, and then talked about capital structure and a few of our various measures to help us there. So that was really about understanding the key drivers for very important numbers in company analysis. What we do now with this reading, this module, is that we look outside the company and look at the industry, try and understand the competitive forces within the industry and our company's position within that industry. Okay, so we'll be focusing on the size of the industry, its growth potential, etc. And then the next module will be looking at the forecasting at the end of all of that. So definitely still sits within this trio of modules about producing a research report, and understanding the industry and the competitive forces is clearly key within that. Okay, so the steps we'll go through and we'll refer to is, first of all, obviously defining the industry, which, there are standard ways of dividing down the industries that, you can get down to quite a detailed level with the global industry classification standards, which are just standard ways of splitting down various sectors. And there's other versions of these. You're not going to be tested on the detail, but obviously it's useful to be able to slice down industries into detail. But companies don't always entirely fit within those categories, so there is an element of subjectivity as to where exactly our company sits. We need to understand the industry itself, its growth potential. We need to understand the competitiveness, which is where Porter's 5 forces. It's a very useful little model. We need to understand external influences. So PESTLE just gives us a good mnemonic to remember what things to think about. And then finally, we think about the competitive strategy. Where does our company sit? What's it trying to do? Does that make strategic sense? Okay, so thinking about the industry, we can categorize our industry in terms of growth rates. So is this a mature industry, or is it still in the growth phase? Mature industries, obviously there's a limit to how much they can grow, and they'll probably converge towards just the general GDP growth rate. Then we've got defensive or cyclical, which you may have seen elsewhere, where we're talking about maybe beta factors of companies. Do they magnify what's going on in the economy? Cyclical. So when the economy does well, they do even better. Or defensive, so they're relatively immune to the ups and downs of the economy. So it depends on things like whether the product is expensive, a luxury, whether it's a kind of one-off big capital item that will be put off when times are bad. So have a look at the 5 on the left and just think where you would put it in that little 2x2 matrix, or style box it could be called, and then we'll see whether we agree. So assuming you've had a chance to think about this. Freight, yes, linked to the economy because it's linked to the volume of goods that need to be transported. It's not a sort of new growth industry, is it? It's been there for decades, centuries even. So it's a cyclical, mature industry. Pharmaceuticals, also mature, but probably more defensive because, people still need the medical support from pharmaceuticals. Gaming, a bit more of a growth area. Certainly it's not been around for centuries, but it's a bit more kind of recent years and decades. So still in the growth phase, we'd say, certainly with new AI and virtual reality and all the rest of it. Arguably fairly defensive, unless it's super expensive new headsets and things, in which case probably might fall into cyclical. So again, it depends on exactly how we're defining it. Semiconductors, relatively new, still a growth area. You could think maybe something similar like battery technology. Cyclical because it's driven by the demand for other goods that use those. and digital advertising, probably sitting in the same bottom right box. Relatively new, still growth area, but very much linked to the economy, isn't it? Whether advertising budgets have got the ability to pay for these new digital advertising methods. Okay, so the point of that is to understand growth. So is it likely to outperform the economy, and what is the economy itself expected to do? So how does that knock on effect hit our company in the industry? So within the industry, we have got measures of market share, because it'd be useful to say the industry is growing and we are a particular size of that industry. And it's a good opportunity to bring in your HHI index, which is basically a way of putting a figure on market share. It's also a way of thinking whether mergers might be allowed, because the competition authorities may get a bit concerned about industries moving towards too much domination by big players. So have a look at the numbers there. We'll work out the index before and after the merger. And the tricky thing I always found to remember, because sometimes it's hard to just remember these things, is do those numbers matter? Are they likely to cause concern? So have a quick go at that and just think, are regulators going to be worried about this? Okay, so before and after. Before 2,500, and industries with these indexes over 2,500 are deemed to be highly concentrated. So anything that increases the HHI after that is going to be looked at. It's gone up by 150 after the merger. Normally we look at 200 starts to be the point where regulators get really concerned. They would probably look at it. They'd want to know and think about whether consumers are being disadvantaged there. But definitely that 2,500 cut-off, where we deem an industry highly concentrated, is one that I would try and commit to memory. Okay. So Porter's Five Forces. You have seen Porter's Five Forces before. It's in the economics prerequisite readings and in one of the modules as well. But does no harm to just remind ourselves it's a lovely model that looks at an industry and basically says, if there's lots of these forces, so the four that have arrows pointing in, and also strong rivalry in the market already, lots of competitors, then it's going to be hard to make good profit margins. So threat of substitutes are other products. They're not competitors because they're already in a different box. It's like if you're looking at air travel, then a substitute product might be road or rail or ferries. Okay, so it's not a competitor, it's a different product. Or indeed Zoom conferencing, because that stops people having to get on planes in the first place. So you've also got on the left-hand side and the bottom there, you've got the supply chain. So the bargaining power of suppliers. The suppliers may hold an essential resource. And if you've got high bargaining power of suppliers, it pushes your costs up. If, on the other hand, your customers have a lot of power over you, maybe there's a big buying group that act together, then it's going to push your prices down. So the worst thing you want really is at both ends of the supply chain having high forces pushing in on you, because it's going to really squeeze your margins. Threat of new entrants is new people coming in and grabbing a share of the market. That's going to push down our profitability as well. And what Professor Porter did, which is slightly different from economics tends to say this is how things should be as an industry. But Porter says, well, let's take how the industry already is. Where does it start from? And if you've got a lot of competitors in there already, then it links with the ideas of perfect competition pushing down your profitability. So it's a good thing to always have at the back of an analyst's mind to think what's going on in the industry and how are these forces acting. And what's good for a company is to put up what we can call a moat around itself, but protect sort of like, for example, the threat of new entrants, put up barriers to entry. If we can stop these forces, it can sort of protect us and allow us to still make profits, which is a good thing. Okay, So we've got the US retailing industry as an example here. So it's just good to pause and think, how might you apply this? Obviously, you're doing a multiple choice exam, but they could still give you low, moderate, high. You won't be writing an essay about this, but it's still good to go through and think about these things. So just pause, take a moment to think about the US retailing industry and how Porter's 5 forces would characterize these forces. Okay, so threat of new entrants, we'd say high, very high. It's very easy for someone to start up as a retailer in the US, relatively small. There's not high capital requirements or, as I say, lots of regulatory burdens and things. So threat of new entrants, pretty high. Threat of substitutes, we're taking quite a wide definition of the industry here, so we'd say that's relatively low. Bargaining power of customers, well, moderate. It's not like they act as a pack. However, the internet has definitely led to more awareness of prices, price pressure. Certainly if you're buying relatively big things, most people will do a price comparison online first. And suppliers, well, it depends. Again, we're talking relatively broad industry here. But if it was special goods, branded goods, quality goods, then you'd have higher bargaining power of suppliers, wouldn't you? And pretty high rivalry. There's a lot of people selling stuff in the market. So we'd say that there's relatively high rivalry already. So what we're seeing is quite high forces there in play in the industry. Okay, so that's thinking about the competitive forces. Pestle just broadens the viewpoint a bit and says, what about all the other things that are going on around the company? And let's try and make sure that we're in line with major movements and certainly not acting against any of these. Okay, so once you've seen what they all stand for, it's fairly straightforward. So political, obviously what does the government or potential government think about the industry that we're in? Economic, how does it fit with economic changes? Social changes, so is something in favour with the current mood? Technological, obviously, and legal, is there any regulation coming in that might have an impact for good or bad? And more, obviously, the environmental concerns. So Pestle has been around as a model for a very long time, but maybe now with social media, perhaps the environmental side of things may be seen as more important. But again, it's a good checklist and it allows analysts to think about what investors may want or may not want exposure to in terms of investments. Okay, so in summary, we've got all of those models that basically allow us to assess a company's strategy using what we understand about the industry. So question 1, does the strategy create a defense against the 5 industry forces? So putting up barriers to entry by having a strong brand or being technologically ahead of the competition. Does the strategy benefit from, or at least not be against, the various Pestle influences that we just saw? And the sense check. Does the company have the resources and capabilities to actually execute the strategy? Okay. Now, Professor Porter, him again, who did the Porter's 5 forces, seminal work on strategy, he suggested that there's generic strategies that are likely to be successful, and if you start mixing these up, you can end up getting kind of stuck in the middle. Your consumers don't really understand your positioning in the market. So we've got a nice summary of this on the next slide, which has basically your 3 generic strategies and then just a little space for you to think about why that may be useful. Which forces will that help protect us against? So cost leadership, it's not necessarily saying that you're the cheapest, you've got the cheapest price tag, but you can produce at the lowest cost. And because of that, you can therefore gain market share by being cheap. It doesn't mean you're necessarily the cheapest, but strategically you've focused on your costs. So if you can get your costs right down, then you are the cost leader. And Porter says that's a good place to be, and the various ways that you can do it. As we saw in the previous module, the economies of scale or economies of scope, where your price comes down because of the volume you're producing. Risks, of course, that costs rise outside of your control, or that people want something more than you can offer. And you can't be everything, can you? You can't be the lowest cost producer. And also, it's like the airlines, you can't be the lowest cost airline, but also have a premium offering. So if you do want to go for the premium side of things, differentiation is the way forward. Invest in the brand, the service, the advertising, the quality of what it is that you are selling. Okay, and that can allow you to do premium pricing. Again, you're not necessarily the most expensive, but you're supporting it with the best product. Okay, obviously it's got different risks. You become too expensive for your customers, or other people copy what it is that you are doing, and maybe even do it cheaper, which would be bad. Then the focus is kind of, you could do focus cost leadership, focus differentiation. Focus just means try and get a niche market and know that market well, and therefore your success is based on understanding your customers, understanding your product, understanding how your product meets their needs. So you're not trying to go mass market, whereas with the other two you could be mass market with that. Okay, so have a think about why you might want to do that, which forces that protects against, and then in a moment check whether you and I agree on the suggestions. Okay, so cost leadership, likely to put people off because they can't come in and do it as cheaply as you can. So it protects against that, protects against the customer power because you're giving them the cheap product. And it should help the industry rivalry. Other competitors might drop out because they just can't keep up. They can't be competitive because they're not as low cost producer as you are. Differentiation, again, threat of new entrants, yes, and substitutes because you're providing something that unique that people want. Could protect against customer power because certainly the pricing power, price comparisons, well, you're doing something different and unique. And supplier power, potentially, as well, because you have the ability to protect your margins as well through being able to charge higher prices. You're less exposed really to the cost pressure from your suppliers. And focus, having that niche focus, protecting you against the threat of new entrants because you know your market, substitutes because you're providing what your customers need, and also customer power because again you are providing a niche market with what they really need. Okay, so that is the end of that particular module. Once again, it's nothing new. I've just tried to put it in the context of where it sits in the curriculum, and hopefully that acts as a refresher on the key things that you need to be able to take away from it.